Inshallah, everyone's doing well. Today, I'd like to do a video that explores the profound impact of lust on the individual and society, and the protective role of religion, drawing on teachings from the Quran and Islamic hadiths. This video examines the moral implications of indulging in lust through the story of Adam and Eve. The video also analyzes changes in sexual norms over time, including the sexual revolution of the 1920s and societal shifts of the 1960s and 70s. It offers an understanding of the consequences of unchecked lust, the protective aspect of religion, and the evolving societal impact of sexual norms. So without further ado, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. In chapter 7, verse 22 of the Quran, Allah says, "And when they tasted of the tree, their nakedness was exposed to them, and they began to sew together the leaves of the garden to cover themselves." Now, the study Quran Tafsir on this verse reads as follows. It says that Adam and Eve's sudden awareness of their nakedness suggests their loss of innocence and evokes a profound sense of alienation, even from themselves, that is, from the honored station in which God had created them. Now, in chapter 7, verse 28 to verse 31, the Quran says that, "O children of Adam," speaking to humanity, "we have indeed sent down unto you raiment to cover your nakedness and rich adornment, but the raiment of reverence, that is better." Taking these verses together, religion and spirituality can be seen to act like a shield or raiment, protecting us from the harmful effects of satanic forces or negative influences. More on raiment a little bit later on into the video. Now, in chapter 7, verse 20, the Quran says that Satan tempted them being Adam and Eve, to expose to them what was hidden from them of their shameful parts. The Quranic commentary on the word or on the phrase shameful parts renders a word by the name of sawatihima. According to Al-Mizan, the word sawa refers to a body part that would disgrace and distress the person if it were to be revealed and seen. I quote, "As asawa literally means shame, disgrace, private part of the body." What are we referring to when we ask what is the private parts of a human being? Well, according to a code of ethics for Muslim men and women written by Sayyid Masood Masumi, he writes that the private parts of a man or men is their rectum or their Johnson and testicles. In the case of a woman, the private part is the vulva or the vajayjay, and rectum or rear end. Continuing with the Quranic verses on Adam and Eve, in the Quran, God says that their Lord called out to them after they had eaten from the tree, Did I not forbid you from that tree and tell you that Satan is indeed your manifest enemy? So the tafsir or explanation of this verse according to Al-Mizan, particularly the part where it says their Lord called out to them, the term that is used to indicate this is the word nida. And Al-Mizan says that this word signifies a distance, indicating that Adam and Eve were far spiritually from their Lord. So when it is said in the Quran that their Lord called out to them, what it really means was that God was calling out to them, but from a spiritual distance. Their spiritual distance was a consequence, of course, of their wrongdoing, as they had become dhalimun, as in verse 35, chapter 2, in which the Quran says, "Do not approach this tree, for then you will become of the wrongdoers." Now, the term dhalim refers to being an oppressor or wrongdoer, and it represents a state of spiritual alienation resulting from transgressing against God's command. Adam acknowledges this wrongdoing in verse 23, chapter 7, where he confesses to God by saying, "O Lord, we have wronged ourselves, and if you do not forgive us and have mercy on us, we will surely be among the losers." Adam and Eve eventually would be forgiven by God, and Adam was chosen for God's revelations. By doing this, God saved Adam from becoming the lowest of the low, as mentioned in chapter 95. By doing this, God saved Adam and Eve from becoming the lowest of the low, as mentioned in chapter 95, verse 5. Indeed, we created man in the best form, but then we reduced him to the lowest of the low. The lowest of the low is a phrase from the Quran that describes when someone loses their spiritual goodness and becomes focused on their lustful and selfish desires. This can happen when people, like Adam and Eve, disobey God's teachings. Religion is important in this context because it acts like a protective shield. It helps us resist the negative effects of our desires and keeps us on a righteous path. In chapter 7, verse 20, God refers to Adam and Eve's private parts as shameful. This is so because our sexual organs and desires can be used in wrong and immoral ways. Today, we can see many examples of people being influenced by their lustful desires. It is important to grasp the profound reality that human beings can only live in one of two states, either in righteousness or in a state driven by lust. This truth is emphasized in the following Quranic verse where God states, in chapter 36, verse 60, "Did I not enjoin on you, O mankind, that you should not worship Shaitan?" Now, of course, this verse is a line that is spoken to human beings on the day of judgment. The phrase, "Did I not enjoin on you that you should not worship Shaitan or Satan," raises an important point regarding the concept of worship. While many may not consider themselves as worshippers of the devil, God attributes being tempted and given in to Shaitan or Satan as a form of worship. This highlights a profound truth that there are essentially two states of existence in the world. One where we flourish spiritually by resisting temptation, and the other where we regress into a default state of being constantly tempted by and succumbing to desires of lust and sensuality. In this default state, our innocence, much like Adam and Eve's, is stripped away. Take, for instance, these two verses. In chapter 7, verse 28, in which God says, O mankind, let not Shaitan tempt you in the same manner as he got your parents out of the garden, stripping them of their raiment. This Quranic verse can be metaphorically interpreted as a warning to all of humanity. It advises people not to allow Shaitan to deceive them in the same way he deceived our parents, Adam and Eve, causing them to lose their state of purity and innocence. The phrase stripping them of their raiment symbolizes the loss of spiritual protection and righteousness. And in chapter 7, verse 26, God says, we have bestowed upon you raiment, you being mankind, to conceal your private parts. Of course, in this case, raiment means clothing. But there is another raiment to which the Quran concludes with. It says, but the raiment of righteousness, that is the best raiment. Now, the term raiment in this verse refers to a metaphorical covering or protection, often associated with righteousness and spiritual guidance. It serves as a spiritual or metaphorical garment that helps individuals guard themselves as well as a society against immoral actions and guides them towards a virtuous and pious life. When the protective raiment is either removed or abandoned, no other alternative exists. Only an all-consuming obsession with lust and sensuality remains. The Quran subtly emphasizes the difference between these two conditions. It says in chapter 19, verse 59, but after them there followed a generation who missed prayers and followed after their lusts. Soon then will they face destruction. Here the Quran is referring to the Jewish people after a certain time of having received revelations from God, that eventually they became disbelievers and they started to let go in their belief in God, culminating ultimately in them no longer turning to God in prayer and worship. And in chapter 29, verse 45, the Quran continues, and establish regular prayer, for prayer restrains from shameful and unjust deeds, and remembrance of Allah is the greatest thing in life without doubt. Regarding the first condition, prayer holds immense significance in Islam, being of the most virtuous act that one can engage in. In essence, prayer embodies Islam's ultimate expression and goal. To neglect it is to forsake Islam entirely. And regarding the second condition, when individuals renounce their religious obligations, They effectively relinquish the inherent restraint and protective influence that helps curb our innate destructive sexual inclinations. This choice paves the way for the emergence of negative sexual norms fueled by unchecked desires of lust and sensuality, gradually eroding the moral foundation of society. Now, Shelley Clark's article entitled The Sexual Revolution of the Roaring Twenties, Practice or Perception. In Clark's article, she explores the transformation of American sexuality during the 1920s. According to Clark, the 1920s did not mark a sudden departure from established values, but rather a period when existing attitudes towards sexuality became more visible. For instance, motion pictures played a significant role in both shaping and reflecting changing moral standards, while sexually charged films influenced the culture that consumed them. It is important to note that the demand for such movies already existed within society. Various groups aiming to uphold traditional morality criticized motion pictures for promoting sexual immorality and for financial gains. The American Social Hygiene Association expressed concern over the commercial exploitation of sexual content in films. However, a survey of theater owners in the 1920s revealed that these sex pictures attracted larger audiences, indicating a strong demand and tolerance for such content. In addition to motion pictures, novels, and plays also challenged Victorian morals during the 1920s. Authors like Aldous Huxley, D.H. Lawrence, Wallace Thorman, and James Joyce broached sexual themes more boldly than conservative and religious groups found comfortable. The success of these sexually explicit works unsettled Victorian ideals. Reform groups such as the American Social Hygiene Association recognized the connection between the consumption of morally questionable entertainment and real-life consequences, particularly in the spread of venereal diseases. They argued that the abandonment of restraint and temperance depicted in novels and plays contributed to the increase in sexually transmitted infections, emphasizing the importance of self-control. In summary, then, Clark's research highlights the nuanced nature of the sexual changes observed in the 1920s. While certain behaviors did undergo transformations, the perception of a radical revolution was exaggerated. Motion pictures, novels, and plays played a role in both reflecting and influencing shifting moral standards. They have not only responded to the social demand, but also initiated the early phases of American sexual evolution, leading to the significant transformation witnessed in the 60s and 70s. By the 1960s, attitudes towards sexual behavior and practices in America began to undergo a significant shift. Eileen Tyler May, in her 2012 writing, examines this trend in relation to the widespread adoption of the pill, which emerged as a revolutionary contraceptive technology. The pill faced opposition from the Catholic Church, which reaffirmed its ban on artificial birth control in 1968 with the papal decree, with the encyclical Humanae Vitae, or of human life. Many Catholic leaders and parish priests disagreed with the Pope's decision and urged Catholics to follow their own conscience. The Pope's decree had little effect on Catholic women's contraceptive choices. By 1970, 2/3 of Catholic women were using birth control, and soon they matched non-Catholic women in their contraceptive use. The pill, along with other forms of contraception, had a significant impact on sexual and family norms by separating sex from procreation. It challenged the traditional link between sex and marriage, as people could have sexual relationships without the risk of having children. Some critics argue that this led to more casual sex and promiscuity, which harmed personal relationships and social stability. They claimed that having sex outside of committed relationships had negative consequences for individuals and society. This perspective attributed these consequences to the societal changes brought about by the sexual revolution of the 1960s and 70s, a time when American culture relinquished its protective spiritual raiment and succumbed to the allure of unchecked sexuality. Catholic priests urging individuals to follow their own conscience in matters of contraception, along with the rise of liberal feminist movements, highlighted the tension between changing societal attitudes and established religious teachings during that period. The American sexual revolution was a period marked by significant changes in attitudes towards sexuality, including increased openness, exploration, and a loosening of traditional sexual norms. A Case Against the Sexual Revolution by Louis Petty is a critical examination of the sexual revolution as a sex-positive movement that emerged in the 60s and 70s and its implications for women in the present day. The book delves into the potential repercussions and outcomes of this movement on women's lives in the 21st century. Perry argues, although believed to the contrary, that the sexual revolution has not liberated women, but in fact exposed them to more harms and pressures from men and society. She challenges some of the assumptions and claims of liberal feminism, such as the idea that sex is a recreational activity, that consent is sufficient to justify any sexual practice, and that sex differences between men and women are irrelevant or oppressive. I will share just a few of some of the harms that Perry identifies in her book. She highlights the abuse and exploitation of women who produce pornography, which often involves violence, coercion, and degradation. The increase in casual sex and promiscuity within the culture, which Perry claims erodes the emotional and relational aspects of sex and exposes women to more risk of sexually transmitted infections, unwanted pregnancies, and sexual assault. The pressure of women to conform to male sexual desires and norms, such as engaging in kink sex, sex work, or polyamory. Perry highlights that these practices are often harmful and degrading to women, and that they reflect a patriarchal culture that commodifies and objectifies women's bodies. Perry's book also explores the impact of the sexual revolution on marriage. She argues the following point: marriage is a social institution that historically regulated sexual behavior and provided stability and security for both partners and children. Perry emphasizes that marriage contributes to women's well-being and happiness. The sexual revolution has weakened marriage by promoting casual sex, promiscuity, and infidelity. She asserts that these practices undermine the emotional and relational aspects of sex, making it more difficult to establish lasting bonds and trust between partners. It is notable that Perry, despite not being religious herself, suggests that marriage can be a solution for promoting healthier sexuality. This viewpoint aligns with the long-standing stance of Islam, which firmly prohibits any form of premarital or extramarital relationships or relations. The Quran contains teachings on sexual ethics, explicitly forbidding sexual relations outside the boundaries of lawful marriage. In chapter 17, verse 32, it states, "And do not approach unlawful sexual intercourse." Unlawful being anything outside the context of marriage. It says, "Indeed, it is ever an immorality and is an evil way." Furthermore, the Quran encourages men and women to safeguard their private parts and maintain sexual purity. In chapter 23, verse 5 to 6, it states, "And they who guard their private parts, except from their wives, acknowledging that this act of intimacy must only take place among spousal relationships, for indeed they will not be blamed." These verses emphasize the importance of preserving chastity, practicing self-restraint, and upholding the sanctity of marriage as the rightful outlet for fulfilling sexual desires in a lawful and responsible manner. Both Perry's viewpoint and Islamic teachings highlight the significance of marriage as a safeguard for women and children, while promoting moral and responsible sexual behavior. So from the 1920s onward, there has been a gradual increase in society's fascination and preoccupation with sexuality and lust, culminating in the sexual revolution of the 1970s, where women were seeking to be more sexually liberated and free. This transformative period paved the way for the sexually charged and unconventional culture that prevails in modern times. In Islamic teachings, specifically in the Hadiths, there are abundant references highlighting the harmful effects of lust on the soul. Here are just a few from Imam Ali al-Islam. He says that the multiplication of sin stems from submission to lust. Lust is one of the two causes of deviation. In other words, a person can that lust is one of the means by which a person loses their religion. Overcome your lust before its ferocity becomes strong, for verily if it becomes strong, it will possess you and use you, and you will not be able to stand up against it. And of course, we're seeing a lot of this in modern culture today. Nothing corrupts God-wariness but the dominance of lust. God-wariness, of course, being someone who seeks to be close and near to God. There is no trial and temptation greater than lust. Counter lust with restraint. By controlling one's lust, one becomes free of every flaw. And lastly, he says, whoever overcomes his lust, his intellect becomes manifest. Taken together, these hadiths convey a significant spiritual message, emphasizing the detrimental outcomes of yielding to lust and the significance of overcoming it, both at the individual and societal level. Lust is portrayed as a fundamental source of sin and deviation, accompanied by a cautionary reminder that its uncontrolled power can exert a profound impact on one's behavior and decisions, affecting not only the individual but also the broader community or cultural fabric. Through exercising restraint, conquering lust is viewed as an indispensable milestone in the journey of spiritual elevation and the cultivation of moral excellence. In conclusion, the story of Adam and Eve's disobedience and loss of innocence highlights the consequences of succumbing to temptation. Humans can only either live in a state of righteousness or be driven by lust. Religion and spirituality serve as protective garments against temptation and lust. However, the sexual revolution has challenged traditional and moral standards. I share with you, in conclusion, a reality TV show featuring young couples engaging in open orgy. This video illustrates how modern culture has become obsessed with sex and lust, moving away from higher spiritual ideals. This raises concerns about the future of sexual norms in an increasingly interconnected and global world, where Judeo-Christian religious influence over secular culture is diminishing, potentially eroding fundamental human values such as self-worth, dignity, and chastity.
We just invited everyone at the party to the after party. Nice. The vibes were so good, it was just like, guys, let's not spoil it, let's just bring the vibes upstairs.
Yeah. I don't even know how many people we've just invited.
Tonight, the pair hoped for an intimate couple swap. Instead, they're in a bedroom with 15 frisky residents.
I don't know what's going to happen.
Crazy.